Thanks for tuning in today. I'm Dr. Nick, the Incrementalist. Join me as I seek out the small incremental changes being applied in other industries that we can learn from and that can be applied in healthcare. Can these changes bring immediate value, but also add up to the big improvements and revolution we need in healthcare? Come along with me to explore the possibilities. My innovative guests from around the globe have used small incremental improvements to achieve their moonshot. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Amy Abernethy. She is the Principal Deputy Commissioner of the FDA and Acting CIO. Amy, thanks for joining me today.
I'm honored to be here with you. Thanks.
Well, always a pleasure to talk to you, and I know extremely busy times all round. I think everybody has a fairly good sense of you, but you're not quite a traditional individual. You've got a really interesting background. You've done a lot of things that are relevant prior to arriving at the FDA. Could you just highlight a couple of the key points? Because I think it's relevant to the context of this before we get into the details.
Sure. So I'm an oncologist by background, so a cancer physician, and have focused for a very long time on how do we learn from every patient, and especially how do we learn from data collected by the physician as a regular part of healthcare, as well as around the individual patient, telling the longitudinal story of what is happening and how does that tell the story of illness. And how can we then ultimately make use of that information to do better evidence generation, understand what works for whom and when, improve personalization, and align care to be with an individual's concerns. I was first at a university, so I was in academic medicine at Duke for 20 years and ran the Center for Learning Healthcare, and then subsequently went to the health tech industry with a company focused on cleaning up data in preparation for real-world evidence and ultimately to do what I just described, which is learning from every patient, and came to the FDA about a year ago, actually a little more than a year ago, really to take it to the next step and say, if we can think about it from the clinical side and the academic side and the tech side, how do we also think about it from the regulatory side to pull the whole system forward?
Fantastic. So for those of you that don't know, that was Flatiron, who I think really paved a incredible path into this sort of aggregation of data very successfully. So, fascinating and important, relevant data point. When we first talked, we were talking about this FDA Modernization action plan and the desire of the FDA to sort of move with the times, essentially, and, understand the digital world and how it plays. You have a program, and in fact, the meeting has been rescheduled, I think, to the end of June 30th. Tell us a little bit about that and what the intent is from the perspective of the FDA, if you could.
Sure. So as you alluded to, we met back at the Consumer Electronics Show at the beginning of January. It does seem like a world ago then. And, I reflected when we were talking then about the fact that coming to the FDA, I was struck by the expectation inside the agency and outside the agency that as a science-based agency, we were going to pave the way in terms of accelerating clinical evidence development and being as modern as possible in how we use data. And I was also struck by the fact that that was the vision and the grand plan, but there were some practical things that were missing. And so that led to the development of the Technology Modernization Action Plan, which we announced in September, and has some key features, the most important of which is making sure that our technical infrastructure at FDA is cloud forward and as robust as possible, and that we're ready to receive and exchange and act on data in as efficient as possible of a way. And that the way that we think about data inside the agency also informs how the industries regulated by the FDA also think about FDA use of data. So, for example, the life sciences industry, the food industry. And so then that Technology Modernization Action Plan led us to announce a new vision for how we manage and use data inside the agency, a enterprise data strategy, which, as you alluded to, we announced at Consumer Electronics Show, and our first big meeting is focused on this topic in June. And the goal of our enterprise data strategy is to say, here's how, as FDA, we're going to think about data, standardize data, think about issues around security and privacy and data exchange, combine data sets. And what are our actions mean for the rest of industry? And how does this signal to industry how different companies can think about data both within their organization as well as across organizations?
And I think you made this point before, but I think it's important to emphasize that this is a regulatory process. So I think at that time you described the docket, I think was what I recall, which is a process for everybody to contribute and participate. Because this is not the FDA saying this is the way we're doing it, right? This is you going out to the community to say, how do we do this and do it effectively?
Right. And, so a docket essentially provides the mechanism through which anybody, so individuals, companies, nonprofits, can communicate with the FDA in a standardized fashion and allow us to get information and consider it both as individual pieces of information, but also in total as we think about, for example, how we're going to use data. And importantly, as I think about what we're going to do inside the agency with our internal use and consideration of data, it has such an overwhelming impact on all of the kinds of industries that we regulate that it's very important that we get public input on what we're thinking. I also think it's really hard to get public input on something that's really amorphous. So the goal at our public meeting is to give some examples. Here's examples of how we're thinking about using data with respect to inspection. Here's how we're thinking about using data with respect to having companies submit safety information efficiently. And those examples also act as straw people that different stakeholders can react and say, here's what excites me about that, and also here's what worries me or I need more details. And so that's part of the process. The combination of the public meeting and the docket really opens up the conversation so we can start to refine these characteristics.
So again, it would be hard to imagine this conversation a couple of months ago, or at least this question specifically, but we're now in a different world. I mean, I don't think we're ever going to return to whatever that normal was. You have to have sort of thought about the impact of COVID-19 on this whole process, not just on the methodology. So at a minimum, that changed the sort of meeting and, how people interacted, but also on the drivers for this. This seems almost even more necessary to drive forward the program and accelerate the challenges that we're facing in terms of innovation.
Honestly, it became existential. And as I, reflect on some of the hopefully compelling arguments I was making towards the end of 2019, I was saying things like, we need this approach and this kind of information so that we can deal with the next vaping lung illness scenario that comes out, or the next Hurricane Maria. And we were ultimately at FDA preparing the ground by thinking about how we make sure that the technology is in place, as well as preparing the thinking by saying, here are the core principles we need to address from a data and data use perspective. But we were in the preparation stage, not in the full action stage. And what happened with COVID-19 is, for many of the aspects as it relates to data, is it accelerated us into full action stage in a 2-month time, and taught us a lot of important things. It doesn't mean that we were completely behind the 8 ball, but it did mean that we had to make sure that we were able to act as quickly as possible with what we already had in place, and then also start to turn on the engines for what else would be needed.
So as you think about some of the drivers here, so it's accelerated, which I think is a good thing, because ultimately, you clearly had that vision. There was a purpose behind this. This is, to me, this is a silver lining. It forces us forward into this new digital age. What are some of the potential plus points that you found within the concepts that you already had? Were the things that you say, wow, we can apply this today? Or has it been, wow, there's just so much that we don't understand about it that we're struggling to sort of apply at this point? Are you able to apply some of the pre-existing principles that you had before?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. And I have learned a lot in this COVID-19 process, including what we could apply today and also what do we want for the future. For example, many data sources are becoming available that are of high quality and recent enough that they can represent what's happening in near real time. Not necessarily 2 seconds ago. Some data sources represent 2 seconds ago, but most of them represent something that looks like a day ago or a couple of days ago. But our ability now to draw upon data sources that are reflective of the movement of COVID-19 as a pandemic, our ability to understand not only what does the pandemic and its explosion look like, but better understand in near real time the characteristics of who gets sick and what does sickness look like.
Right.
The illness trajectory across time, if a person has mild illness or moderate to severe illness and ends up in the hospital on a ventilator. To understand in near real time what kinds of treatments are doctors drawing upon, and for example, what does that mean in terms of what we need to plan for in drug utilization surges and potential drug shortages. And these kinds of questions are being answered by data that are available that we're able to start to identify and figure out how to analyze. And I think one of the things that's been really important, which we knew is a core principle, but we've seen this, is to be able to not only characterize data sets and their individual features, know their underlying quality principles and potential biases. So essentially, when are data going to be fit for purpose, and when might they be as able to lead to compelling and least biased results? And also, how can we now be thoughtful about putting together different data sources that fill in data gaps and also fill in the story longitudinally across time? And many of those were core principles that we thought we were going to be looking towards for our use of data, but actually we saw them come to the surface in the COVID-19 scenario.
So for those of you just joining, I'm Dr. Nick, the Incrementalist, and today I'm talking to Dr. Amy Abernethy. She's the Principal Deputy Commissioner for the FDA and Acting CIO. We were just talking about the COVID impact and the quality of data. The concept of essentially what it sounded like was scoring of data. So a quality indicator sounds really intriguing. How are you going about that? What sort of measures are you able to incorporate that allow you to sort of apply those principles? Because that's really important. If we have good quality data, then we can make better decisions, right?
And, I always say that all data has warts. And one of the things that we need to do with data is try and avoid data judgment and get objective about understanding the features of every data set and what it brings to the story. One of the things that we're learning in the real world data space, so these are data sets that either are passively collected, for example, electronic health records data or claims data, or may be intentionally collected around a specific observational purpose like registries or pragmatic clinical trials. One of the things that we're learning for these kind of data sets is that we need to understand how an individual data set is appropriately fit for the purpose or can be combined with or otherwise improved and cleaned up in order to meet the purpose that we're trying to put it into place. And something that I've been talking about personally for a very long time is that we need a consistent way of describing the attributes or features of data sets and also the quality features so that we can understand quickly as we look at almost like the nutrition label for data and understand what the quality looks like and also be able to quickly characterize how it may be fit for the purpose at hand. It's interesting that in the COVID-19 scenario, I'm seeing this play out really in real time as on a day-to-day basis, the number of data sets that I'm currently looking at, it's got its own doubling time. Right. And that as we're looking at these data sets, we need to actually be able to step back and say, what's the attributes of these data that I need to understand? How can I understand its relative merits for different attributes compared to other data? How might we combine them together? How are we going to deal with issues around confidentiality and privacy and different concerns? And how do we do this quickly enough and at scale so that we can get to answers that we need for COVID-19? And also learn by doing so that we can then repurpose what we've learned in the COVID-19 scenario for the future. What is interesting about this, Nick, is that you alluded to that June 30th meeting, and it was originally March 27th, and I had the agenda all planned. And I really do think we're going to end up needing to rethink some of the agenda in order to account for what we've learned in COVID-19 and say, okay, here's where we are, and what does this tell us about going forward?
Right, I mean, I certainly, I'm signed up to go, and I'm thinking I'm going not just to contribute, but also to learn from much of that experience that was, carved in urgency of that activity that was designed to try and meet this, incredible, overwhelming need that we've seen. Underlying principle, and tell me if this is wrong, I think from an FDA standpoint, is to speed things up, right? This is about accelerating innovation safely. Would that be a fair sort of assessment?
Yeah, and I talk about this in the language of efficiency, where achieving efficiency ideally does help us do things faster. But really what we're doing is achieving efficiency to make sure that we maintain the quality of the work, but we're also scaling our work both from the standpoint of being able to do more, but also being able to get what I call time to insight faster.
So as you try and project forward, and I think that's become a lot harder these days, but we still have to, or at least still try. What is success? What's a good result or an outcome of this program look like in your mind?
So, Nick, I had a really strong understanding of that about 2 months ago, and I've got to stop and think about this for a second. If I was defining this 2 months ago, I would have said the success for our 2020 enterprise data agenda would be having a series of living examples or use cases where inside of the FDA and outside the FDA, we could all understand what does it mean in order to make better data-informed decisions and improve the efficiency and time to insight, and make sure that we all understand what capabilities and governance and other requirements have to be in place in order to pull that off, and that we'd also continue to unlock those capabilities so that we can bring them to bear. In a 2 months later context, I'm not calling this post-COVID because I don't think we're post-COVID, but in a 2 months later context, I think what I've just said still continues to be true, but now we've actually been pressure testing many of the requirements and potential capabilities. And I expect that part of what good looks like is we're having a very objective discussion about that worked and that didn't work. Here's what I need to learn, and here's how I'm going to go faster. And that we're also not sitting back on our heels and just slowly sort of going about the pace of developing the systems that we need to make data-informed decisions, but we're actually doing so with a level of urgency that says, again, this is existential.
So I tease out of that, the positive aspect of that is that sense of urgency that hopefully it's instilled in all of us of the importance of this and, driving this forward in a way that, as you describe, unlocks capabilities and, improves our access to this innovation. One of the things that sort of keeps recurring in my mind was a paper that I read. Well, it wasn't a paper, it was an article written by Chris Anderson that talked about the end of theory. This data deluge that we're now sort of seeing essentially makes the scientific method obsolete, so that no more of the randomized controlled study. Well, not no more, but I think less important. Do you see that as a potential? So to be clear, I'm not saying we discard science. That's absolutely not my position. But do you see a faster path because we have more of this data, as you said, with a quality indicator and a consistency across a time frame that allows us to get to, at a minimum, correlation, even if it's not causation, that will start to guide us in the way that Google does with its translation expertise? It doesn't understand English to French, but it knows it can produce that translation. Do you see that as a possible outcome at some point in the future of this?
I see that as a possible outcome. I don't know, as an outcome of this, sort of in my mind, suggests a temporal relationship that's quite short, and I'm not quite sure what that temporal relationship is going to look like. I also, having been right in the middle of trying to push a lot of this work forward, anticipate that the world that we're moving towards is a and landscape rather than an or. And what I mean by that is that I do think that thoughtful, purpose-driven, hypothesis-driven analyses that get us to answers that we understand and can have confidence because we also understand what we think to be biologic plausibility or interrelationships and can explain them in other qualitative ways as well. I think that's going to continue to be very important as we make sense of the world. And I think that also is likely going to be paired with a number of sense-making techniques that come from large, often difficult to interpret machine learning and AI-based analyses that tell us about different kinds of patterns and relationships that we really probably couldn't have seen without those blurred boundaries that AI brings to us. And so I actually think that we're going to get to as a place where both of these approaches become really important to make sense of the world around us, but that we really shouldn't be in a place where we discount one at the expense of the other.
Yeah, no, I agree, absolutely. And I think that visualization of the data is so challenging, but we've now got all of these tools that help us and more of that data that sort of, allows us to guide that whole process. So I think very exciting times. We're close to the end. If I could just get you a little bit of a sense of an ask maybe of all of the participants in this new world that we're emerging into. What would you like to see? What would be helpful to the FDA as part of that process and in terms of contribution? What would be your ask?
So one of the things I've learned through the COVID-19 story is the importance of community. It has been amazing how people have come together with a sense of purpose and a sense of contribution. So my ask is that same sense of community, a sense of community that really is about how do I build for a better future, actually gets brought to how do I build to a better future with data that doesn't bring a whole bunch of personal needs and ambitions, but actually rather community and multi-stakeholder. Why do I say that? Because I think there's such an urgency around this, and I think it's really important to have so many lenses and so many voices, that the more that we can bring to the table, here's how I think we should do it, here are important use cases, here are capabilities to unlock, here's my best ideas in a way that actually is synergistic. I think that's going to be what moves us forward. And one of the amazing things about COVID-19 is that's what we're seeing in real time as people figure out how to work together to solve this problem.
I don't think I could have said it any better myself. I mean, I love that the sense of community that this has created and the drive in a single direction that has united so many folks, I think is an extraordinarily valuable commodity that we should absolutely capitalize on. So thank you for articulating something that I was thinking but had not voiced in such terms. So always great to catch up. I know incredibly busy for you, and the fact that you made the time for me, I greatly appreciate. So Amy, thank you for joining me on the show today. It's been a great pleasure, as it always is.
Nick, it was an honor, and thank you for your time.
Thanks for joining me today. Do you have any better ideas, or have you found a small incremental change that's brought about a big improvement in your world? Let's continue the conversation on our hashtag, the Incrementalist, or share with me at DrNick1 on Twitter. You can find more information about the show on our program page at healthcarenowradio.com. And tune in next time to hear my discussions with leaders and innovators from around the globe who've revolutionized their space by using small incremental improvements to achieve their moonshot. I'm Dr. Nick, the Incrementalist, and I'm starting a revolution through evolution.